Welcome to People More Interesting Than Me, the podcast, where I step back and let fascinating individuals take the spotlight. Join me as I sit down with incredible guests who captivate and inspire, showcasing their stories, experiences, and wisdom that make them truly extraordinary. Tune in for engaging conversations that'll leave you enlightened and entertained. At least I'm entertained. This week's guest is someone who's made a profound impact in the world of law, technology, and beyond. Joining us is Brian Beckcom, a top-tier trial lawyer, cybersecurity expert, and the founder of VB Attorneys. Brian has spent decades fighting for justice, representing clients in some of the most high-stakes legal battles, from complex injury cases to cutting-edge cyber law. But what sets Brian apart is his ability to blend his legal expertise with a passion for technology and innovation, helping his clients navigate an increasingly digital world. In this episode, we'll talk about Brian's journey from the courtroom to the tech square, the challenge of modern law, and how he's using his platform to advocate for the little guy in a big tech world. Whether you're interested in law, technology, or the intersection of the two, this conversation is packed with insights you won't want to miss. Enjoy. Today I've got Brian Beckcom with me today, and I've gone through, I wouldn't say his resume, but like everything he's got his hand in. It's like if you looked at it, you'd be like, oh, okay, so he has no free time whatsoever. That's what I see from all of this. But obviously, your main thing is you're an owner and trial lawyer. But I mean, just looking at what I've got, you've got not just that you're a lawyer, but you've got your hands in everything. You're a computer scientist. You have jujitsu, which surprisingly, like, from what I've read, is like one of the best, hand-to-hand things to get into. Like specifically, just because it's not just, like self-defense from an outside point of view. It's very good for body movement, like awareness, and it takes time. It's just not like one of those things you go to an hour course every week. It's like a constant practice from what I've seen. And all this other stuff, like first question to start the podcast, how do you find the time? And also, you have ADHD like me, right? Or
I tell my wife every time I never lose anything, but I misplace things occasionally, and oh, you're always losing stuff. I just tell her I'm an absent-minded genius because I'm always thinking about stuff, and it's normally not like what's right in front of me. So, but my dad used to, when I was growing up, I used to tell my dad is kind of my hero. He was a Air Force, fought in Vietnam, 200 combat missions, distinguished flying cross, and more importantly, raised my brother and I as a single father after my mother died of cancer. And he never missed a single sporting event while working full-time as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and then as a high school teacher. And he always used to say, he said, whenever somebody tells me I don't have the time, I just say, you have the same time as everybody else does. You're just not prioritizing it. So actually, I wish I had about 10 times as much time I have, because I'm getting to the age now, Michael, where I have to pick, and I'm 51 years old, and I have to pick and choose what I spend my time and attention on. And so 4 or 5 years ago, when I started jujitsu, for example, like you said, it takes a lot of time, not just the hour and a half a day of training that I was doing, but also the study outside of class and thinking about it and so forth. And so I'm at the age now where every time I engage in an activity, I always ask myself, is this a good use of your time? Because the time is limited, but I have the same amount of time as everybody else does. It's kind of funny because from looking from the outside, sometimes I think about this and I'm like, yeah, you run a podcast, you run a law firm, you have 3 kids, you train jujitsu every day, you're a single digit golfer, you like to fight. Like, people would think that, like just how you said, like, how do you have the time? And from the inside, I just feel like I'm living my life, quite frankly. I don't think it's that big a deal. So But there are certain things I prioritize and certain things I don't. And that I think is the most important thing.
So, is that a science degree from Texas A&M or
Yeah.
out of that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's perfect. So, what made you get from computer science to being a lawyer? Was that always in the plan?
I told this story a bunch of times. The way I explain it is studying computer science in the early 90s. I'm in a computer lab with a bunch of dorks all day long for 4 years. And I decided I don't want to sit behind a computer screen my whole life with a bunch of dorks. So I went to law school. And what do I do 25 years later? I sit behind a computer screen with a bunch of nerds. But really, what happened was I was playing basketball in college. That's what I wanted to do. I was a high school basketball player. Went down to A&M, had no idea what I wanted to study. Personal computers had just become kind of a thing. I was interested in them. I said, "Hey, man, why don't I just major in computer science?" I didn't realize when I made that decision that I was going to have to take calculus 1, 2, 3, 4, differential equations, linear algebra, all this high level math, which I did not like at the time. I actually love math now, but I just kind of backed into it because computers, personal computers in particular, had kind of become a thing. I had one of the first email addresses in college in 1991. Problem was nobody else had an email address, so I couldn't email anybody. But then, to be quite honest with you, I got to the point in college where I was about a junior or senior, and I realized the things I really, really like to do is I like to read and I like to write, and I like to help people that were in trouble. And so that's kind of what ultimately sent me off to law school. When I got to law school, I was getting recruited to be a patent lawyer. And I was asking these patent lawyers, like, what's it like to be a patent lawyer? And they were saying, oh, it's like writing a research paper every week. And I said, man, that sounds awful. So I kind of moved in a slightly different direction. The other thing I'll say about being a trial lawyer is when my mother died as a result of some very, very serious medical negligence, very, very obvious serious medical negligence. Had these doctors did the thing they should have done, she would have survived. And unbeknownst to me, my dad sued the United States government because they were Air Force doctors and won. And so I think subconsciously, I've always kind of wanted to be that lawyer that helped, the damsel in distress, so to speak. So lot of different reasons, but
Yeah, I mean, it makes your origin story makes complete sense. Uh, so, and kind of tying these together just to kind of, uh, make it sound fluid. We were talking about kind of managing your time. How do you pick and choose? Because obviously, you want to help everyone out, but there's only, just like we said, there's only so much time. So how do you choose, like these cases over one another?
That's something I still struggle with today, Michael, because like you said, I want to help everybody. And what I found is, like, I take on very, very large cases. I take on cases where we're talking about tens of millions of dollars in dispute potentially. But then I also take cases where we're talking about tens to like $10,000 in dispute, $15,000 in dispute. And the problem with taking on the $10,000 cases and the $10 million cases is the $10,000 cases take just as long as the $10 million cases, by and large, at least from like an effort standpoint and a mental effort. And so if I take too many of the smaller cases I do a lot of pro bono work. I help people a lot for free with a lot of things. But if I do that too much, then I won't be able to do a good job on the really big cases where, for example, I'm representing a 25-year-old that's got a catastrophic brain injury who will be on government assistance if I can't win his case. Those are the kind of, or, a family who's lost a father who will be out on the street if I can't get them a good settlement. And so I still take cases I probably shouldn't take from time to time. But I really try to focus on the cases that are going to have the most impact on people's lives. That's really the criteria I look at.
And do you look at that at like, obviously, but to like the person listening, you hear about all these court cases with like Apple or Google, and they settle for, like $25 million. Or let's give an example that I actually know semi well is the Red Bull case. Like they they went to trial and then they got found that, people don't have wings. It was false advertising. So people,
Yeah.
if you had bought Red Bull between, the years of 2007 or 2013, you can see a $5 check. Like, just for I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you kind of weigh how many people, like say, like 25, let's say 2 million people are affected in this lawsuit, because obviously the payout is as large as how many people have been affected and to what volume each person has been affected. Is there, I don't know how to phrase this, but it's not an equation that you guys look at how much good you can get out of it per person. Just like you were saying, like it's the same amount of work for that large mass of people as it is like those two people, but those two people have been, like severely harmed. It's like the woman from you probably hear this all the time, but the hot coffee from McDonald's, the woman who,
Yeah.
like got severely burned from the coffee. What a lot of people don't know is like supposedly she asked McDonald's to cover the medical expenses. She wasn't even going to sue, but like, like they refused. And then when they refused, this is when like this whole thing got blown out of proportion.
Yeah.
So I guess my main question is, do you guys try to, when you try to maximize your time per helping an individual or a mass amount of people, is that quantitative to like numbers, not just money?
Not for me. It is for some people. For me, it's more about, is this a case that I feel strongly about? Is this a case where I feel like the person or the group of people that I'm representing have truly been wronged and I can truly make a difference? So I'll give you two examples of this real quick. And by the way, before I say this, your listeners need to understand in 99.9% of all lawsuits that you hear about that either go to trial or there's something weird about it, the fault is an insurance company. Insurance companies are a necessary evil, but they are evil. Like they are not moral. They are not ethical. They do not think the same way human beings think about these kind of things. So when you talk about quantitative, if you were burned over 90% of your body, they would be calling you a claimant. They would not be calling you Michael or a human being. You're a number on a spreadsheet to them, no matter how badly you're hurt. And the problematic thing, of course, is when you work for an insurance company as an adjuster, your brain gets twisted in a way that is really unethical and immoral. But in order to work for the insurance company, you have to think that way, or the insurance company can't function as a business. So all insurance companies care about is how much money they can make. In fact, they're legally required to do that because in our country, we've decided that's the most important thing for corporations is profit. We didn't have to do that, but we have done that. And so your example, the McDonald's coffee cup, is a great one. They would have settled that case for $5,000, but there was an insurance adjuster who had been taught by his or her superiors that every single case is frivolous, and it's more important for us to save a nickel than to actually do what we promise to do when people give us money. There's a great saying about, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, the difference between a banker and an insurance person is a banker gives you money in exchange for a worthless piece of paper. You give an insurance company money and they give you a worthless piece of paper. So basically every single problem that you read about in the legal system, not all of them, but the vast majority are caused by insurance companies. So that's kind of the first thing. But let me give you two examples of cases where there was a large group of people and a small group of people. So right now, my firm represents about 1,000 homeowners in the Houston area that were intentionally flooded by the government in order to save everybody else in Houston from Hurricane Harvey. We've already won that case. That's a lot of people to represent, but that's going to have a massive impact not only on their lives, but on the lives of a lot of people in Houston, because now the government is going to realize that they have to do a better job of flood control. And if they don't, they're going to have to pay people for taking their property. So the other thing about that is I live in the center of that neighborhood. So a ton of these clients are my neighbors and friends, and they reach out to me and I want to help them. This is exactly why I became a lawyer. But then on the other hand, the example I was giving you earlier, I represented a 25-year-old Texas A&M graduate who was severely brain damaged by a Union Pacific 18-wheeler. And he's made a somewhat remarkable recovery, but he still can't see, he's still brain damaged, and he's going to need care for the rest of his life. And I got to know his family and him personally. And so I can't get to know all 1,000 of my Hurricane Harvey clients personally, but in some cases I can get to know the client. And these are great people. Like the A&M grads, mom and dad both quit their jobs to basically be full-time caregivers for him. And thankfully, because we got them a very large settlement, they don't have to do that anymore. Now they've got professionals doing that. But it's more about another thing. I handled the 3M earplug cases. 3M, the big conglomerate, basically bought an earplug company that had knowingly defrauded the U.S. military and sold them earplugs that actually had the reverse effect. It actually accentuated the sound of gunshots and bombs and stuff like that. And so we got literally over 1 million veterans that have severe hearing loss because the equipment they were sold was defective, and everybody knows it was defective. They didn't tell the veterans that. But of course, I got into those cases because I have a military upbringing, I have a military background, and I respect the military, and I have a ton of friends in the military. So again, for me, it's more about, for some lawyers, it's about just nothing but the numbers. For me, it's more about, is this a worthy cause? And is this something where I feel like I can make a difference, either in one individual's life or in potentially thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people's lives?
No, that sounds great. And just touching on what you were talking about, the Houston flooding, something that I've never come to realize is just how rewarding or how important is it to you when you win a case, the precedents that it kind of sets up for future cases. Obviously, you were talking about like the government has to do a better job, and that way, like, people can come back, and sue the government for that, where it would be much easier because they have the precedence of, the lawsuits before. In some of the cases that you've done, does that make, let's say, lawsuits kind of moot, whereas it's a payout rather than a huge, like, it's more like they knew, as long as there's evidence or video or, like confirmation that it's not really going to a legal matter since, it's already happened before.
Yeah, you're never going to get paid in any case unless you file a lawsuit. At least you're never going to get paid fairly, whether there's precedent or not. The insurance companies, this is the battle that goes on. So I beat their brains in because they do bad things. And when jurors hear about what they're doing, they say, you're doing a bad thing and we're going to make you pay for it. And what the insurance companies often do, rather than fix the bad things, is they go and pay a bunch of money to lawmakers that can change the law so those bad things aren't illegal anymore. So that's the constant battle we have. And again, this is because you got to keep in mind, insurance companies are nothing. They're not real. Neither are corporations. They're figments of our imagination. They're pieces of paper where people get together and they get certain legal protections and certain things like that. But we treat them as humans in some way, which is weird to me, because a corporation has no feelings. A corporation has no ethics. A corporation has no morals. A corporation could care less about who you are or who I am because they don't exist. And so under the guise of a corporate form or an insurance form, you're able to do things that you would never, ever, ever do if it was just me and you sitting here talking. I'll give you an example of this. Many years ago, Ford Motor Company made a car that's gas tank blew up if you hit it at 5 miles an hour from the rear, the Ford Pinto. And they knew about this problem, and they knew there was a 5-cent fix. And there was an engineer that said, screw it, let 100 people burn to death and we'll just pay for it. And this memo came out. And to me, the interesting thing about that situation is not that it happened, but how could somebody who is who goes home to their family and looks their kids in the eye, how could they come home from a job where they've just said with certainty at least 100 people will burn alive because it's more important for me to give the CEO a little extra bonus? Like, how is that morally possible? And the answer, quite frankly, is because we've allowed corporations and insurance companies to run roughshod over everyone. And that's the way the system's set up. Yeah, it used to be, it was a privilege to be a corporation. So when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he was the trust buster. He saw the problems with corporations. And so people were much more cautious about it. Now I can go over to the post office and, open a corporation in 30 minutes. So the problem is not necessarily with the individual people. The problem was that the incentives are set up in such a way that the only thing that matters is money. And when you say, if I were to say to you, Michael, the only way I'm going to judge you as a human being from now on out is how much money you make. That's it. You would behave differently than you do if I say, I'm going to judge you based on whether you have good character, whether you're honest, whether you're empathetic, whether you try to help people. So the way we judge corporations is different than the way we judge individual human beings. And frankly, the way we judge corporations doesn't have to be that way. Like, we could say profit is important, but so is the well-being of the community that you live in, for instance. Or, so the point is we've set this up on purpose this way, and we could change it tomorrow if we wanted to. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's great. It just pops into my head that kind of like all these corporations, because I work at a company where, like, my boss, he's obviously the owner, so he can kind of drive. And this actually sounds bad, but the best thing is he's not really driven by money. He's driven by like a good product, which I find to be the best way to engineer stuff. And when I look at like some of these corporations, the issue with it is that they're not individuals. They're a collective, just like you say. Like, you've got people looking quarterly at what the bottom line is. And obviously all these people's jobs, and what we saw in the last like 3 years, like with everyone moving, kind of virtually, exactly like we're doing, is the fact that like all those people lost their jobs 2 years later with like, all these big corporations. There was huge layoffs. And I don't know, with that, it just, when it comes to the bottom line, there's no quantitative, obviously on some levels, there are quantitative levels to see besides money that it has like a positive effect. A lot of, and what I've seen is a lot of corporations that aren't, like on the stock exchange, they don't have, like a bottom line. They don't have dividends, stuff like that. The private ones, sometimes if they're driven by the right people, they usually have a more positive effect. But that's not, obviously there are exceptions to the rules and, greed.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. And I'll give you an example of kind of what we're talking about here. I think I hear about the minimum wage debate, and this is the argument you hear. If we raise the minimum wage, then McDonald's is going to have to lay off low income or people, low wage earning employees. Okay. That is patently false. Okay. So every time you hear that narrative, I can guarantee the person that's spouting that narrative is either lying to you intentionally or is an idiot when it comes to economics, because that is not the way things work. So you work at a private corporation, it sounds like. I work at a private corporation. I own my company. And if the government, I don't pay my people minimum wage, I pay them way more than that. But if the government were to say I had to raise their wages, that doesn't mean I have to lay anybody off. Now, I might have to take a slight pay cut in order to make sure my people got paid a little bit more. But that doesn't mean I have to lay off a single person. So let's take McDonald's as an example. Oh, we're going to have to lay off a bunch of people. low wage earners if they raise the minimum wage. Hey, meanwhile, I'm making $50 million a year as the CEO of McDonald's. How about we do this? How about we raise the minimum wage and you lower your $50 million a year salary just a tiny bit? And that's the part of this that people forget about. So, and I don't have a position one way or the other on the minimum wage. I'm just saying the argument is a complete and total obvious fallacy. The argument that you're going to have to lay off a bunch of people is horseshit, quite frankly, if you're in a profitable corporation. If you're not in a profitable corporation, then it has nothing to do with the minimum wage. It has to do with how you're running your business, and you need to get your business running profitably before we even talk about anything else. But if you're running a business that's making money and somebody tells you need to pay your people a little bit more, then there's a couple ways to do it. You can lay off people, and that's what you do if you're a jerk, or if you have people you don't need, which is a business problem. Or you can say, me as the boss, I'm going to take a little bit of a pay cut in order for the people below me to make a little bit more.
Yeah. And, you know, you hear about all the, and we've been hearing, or I've been hearing about this since like the 2008 housing crisis, where like people were taking these huge like buyouts. Even with a couple of banks in the last like 2 or 3 years, you've seen like the CEOs will take like buyouts of millions of dollars. And I'm thinking like like I'm trying to play devil's advocate and feel their opinion. I'm like, what are they doing with $25 million? Like,
well, keep in mind, though, Michael, this is an important point. You're raising an important point. When you say CEO, and when you say buyout, in almost every instance, that's a publicly traded company, right? Or it's a company that's owned by somebody other than the CEO. So we got to keep in mind, most CEOs of publicly traded corporations didn't start the company, didn't take the risk with the company. They're not founders. They're not entrepreneurs. They're management is all they are. And so when you say they're taking a $25 million buyout after running the company into the ground, what they're doing is they're stealing from the shareholders and the employees that hired them to run the company right. And I don't know what to do about this problem, but it's like you get paid for failure when you're at a public corporation a lot of the times. So, or if the company does good, you make $100 million. If the company does bad and you get fired, you only make $50 million. Those are terrible incentives. Because here's the problem with that incentive structure. If I know I'm going to make $100 million if the company does good, and I'm going to have a $25 million golden parachute if it does bad, I don't care if it does bad, really, because I'm going to be fine either way. So what am I going to do? I'm going to make the riskiest possible decisions I can make, because I'm going to go for that 100 million. And if I blow the company up, who cares? Everybody else eats it, not me. Whereas if you're in a private company and you're the owner and you founded it, and you're not going to take those same risks, because you're not going to have a golden parachute because there's nobody to bail you out. So again, this is a structural thing. And and I'm not saying people that work at corporations or insurance companies, individuals, are bad necessarily. I'm saying the structure that they're in forces them to think poorly and to do sometimes bad things,
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And it kind of cycles back to, like some of the examples you were talking about. Like, for example, I'm not trying to blast 3M, but I mean, with the vicious cycle, like how do you, probably very in depth how that happened. Like probably emails got buried. We don't want to bring it up. Like we've got, like shareholders meeting in a month. Let's not talk about a lawsuit coming to hit us. Like it's just a vicious cycle of how do we keep this boat with holes afloat? Like we just need to keep it going. We're not trying to like make the boat better. We're just trying to make sure we can keep on fishing, like keep on loading this boat up. We're not worried about how well the boat is or if it's doing well. We're worried about, again, the bottom line. And just to ask you a question, obviously there's probably more cases, but what would you say the percentage to private versus public companies you deal with, or basically you take to court or sue?
The vast majority of companies I deal with are public companies or larger companies, but not all of them.
Yeah, I
But
would figure there's.
the reality is, though, and again, I want to emphasize this to people, especially if you're sitting on a jury or something, you need to know that behind every corporation, every lawsuit, every legal case is an insurance company. Pretty much, not every single time, but the vast majority of the time, it's really the insurance companies. The corporation is the name defendant, but it's the insurance company that's making all the decision. And in most states, you are not even allowed to tell the jury that there's an insurance company behind the scenes. And why is that?
Because
Because
the
the insurance
lobbyists got
companies
paid by
have
the
made
insurance.
laws. Yes, exactly. And, so I'll be sitting there in a rear end 18-wheeler accident with somebody who's severely injured, and I'll be picking a jury, and somebody will always inevitably ask me, why hasn't the insurance company settled this? I'm not allowed to answer that question. So what I say is, I really wish I could answer that question, but the judge has told me not to talk about those issues. But this is just yet another example, like I'm saying, of insurance companies capturing the process. Like all of the stuff you read about frivolous lawsuits, all of the stuff you read. Let's take an example. You ever heard the phrase ambulance chasing? Have you
Yeah,
ever heard of that?
yeah.
Ambulance
With the
chasing is a
collar.
term. Yeah. So a lawyer is prohibited from contacting somebody that's been hurt in an accident unless they had some sort of prior relationship with him. Okay. It's a felony. It can be a felony to do that. That's ambulance chasing. But insurance companies, literally, from the moment something happens, have people all over the scene trying to get people to sign stuff, pay. They're the biggest ambulance chasers around. And they've made it legal for them to chase ambulance. I mean, I've had cases where they tried to settle with a severely injured client of mine for $5,000. Fortunately, they don't take it. They end up paying $2 million. I mean, so all of this stuff, for the most part, is driven by the profit and profit only seeking mentality of large multinational insurance companies. That's really what drives a lot of the problems in the legal system. If the insurance companies didn't have so much influence, I think things would be a lot better.
So that was going to be my devil's advocate question, because earlier you mentioned insurance companies being a necessary evil. I was going to ask you, is that what you kind of see that would help improve the system? Is a basically, to quote Adam Smith, it would, which is a different way I'm using it. Insurance is basically an invisible hand that we don't see that's kind of interfering with the legal system, which if they had a lesser kind of wrap around, the government, all these Fortune 5 companies, do you feel like that might make the system run more fairly, more equal?
I think Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both said it perfectly. Okay. So I'm about to say something, believe it or not, that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both totally agree with, or at least they've said they asked Trump, like, you gave when he was running for president, and now the same deal. He gave money to Kamala Harris. He gave money to Hillary Clinton before he ran for president. And Trump got up there and said, of course I did. That's the system. That's how the system works. And Bernie Sanders said, you think these pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies are giving campaign donations out of the kindness of their heart? Of course they're not. It's legalized bribery is what it is. And the problem is we've got a Supreme Court case that is one of the worst cases that's ever been decided from a purely legal philosophical standpoint. It's called Citizens United. And it says, for purposes of political donations, corporations are people, which is not the case. It's not in the Constitution. It was never the law until the Supreme Court said. Matter of fact, the opposite was the law. And so now corporations can give basically unlimited donations, and they have far more influence on the process than an individual like me or you would have, because we just don't have the same amount of resources. So again, it's a structural issue that comes down to the way we finance our political system.
Yeah, man. And I think that happened recently in the last 6 months, didn't it?
Citizens United?
Yeah.
That's been around for a while now, probably gosh, I don't know, 5, 10 years now, but there's been a bunch of cases that have kind of popped out of that.
Okay.
And
I thought I had heard something about that recently. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's
let,
something
let, let me
different.
let me just ask you this question very simply. Do you think Bill Gates or Michael Strumsky has more influence on the political process?
Guess Bill Gates.
Why do you think that is? Do you think Bill Gates is more moral or ethical than you? Do you think he knows more about politics necessarily than you or I do? Of course not. It's because he's got way more money. And that's the only reason, quite frankly. And I think sometimes in our country, we mix up the idea of having a lot of money with being a really good person. And those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand. So, again, let's use another tech example. Take Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, any of these big tech people. They're not only making decisions about the underlying technology we use, they're making decisions about the ethics of how we use it. Okay. When it comes to the technology, I'll defer to the engineers and the Silicon Valley folks about how to write the programs and all that stuff. But when it comes to the ethics of it, like, for example, what are we going to show kids under 18? Are we going to allow foreign actors to interfere with social media? Those are ethical questions. Those are not technological questions. And just because you have a lot of money, because you got a bunch of government subsidies like Elon Musk did, doesn't mean you're going to be the best person to answer the ethical questions. We need philosophers, quite frankly, and ethicists to answer the ethical questions, not a bunch of technical, not a bunch of people in Silicon Valley who, again, not necessarily bad people, but their incentive is not for the greater good. Their incentive is to make as much money as they can for themselves and their corporation. And so it's an incentive thing is what it is.
Yeah. And another thing that a lot of people get twisted is the fact that you might be an expert in something that, and then people quantitate that must mean that they're an expert in a lot of other things.
Everything else.
Yeah.
I'll give you another good example of this. John D. You ever heard of John D. Rockefeller? Like
Yeah.
the original type, the original free market.
The guy trying
Everybody,
to buy up every process from,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, he tried to buy all the railroad lines. He tried to buy all the all that stuff. He publicly stated many times that capitalism was bad. At least when it came to oil and gas, he wanted monopolies because he felt like monopolies were more stable. So even like the people that we hold up as these paragons of free market capitalism aren't free market capitalists for the most part. Like they seek out monopoly power just like anybody else would do because it's rational in the context in which they're operating. Again, that's a structural thing. That's not necessarily individual people doing bad things. That's the structure of the system being set up in a way to encourage people to do things that may not be ethical.
Yeah. So before I ask my famous last question, is there anything you're working on that you kind of want to share with listeners, projects, obviously your podcast?
So the podcast is Lessons from Leaders with Brian Beckcom. I feature really positive people, most of whom you probably haven't heard of, but they're what I call the silent leaders. Like we've got a lot of people on TV that claim to be leaders, but in reality, the day-to-day leaders are people you never hear of. They're the people in your communities, the deacons of the church, the person on the school board, the person that's donating their time to charity. Those are the real day-to-day leaders. And so that's what I try to focus my podcast on. And then if you want to follow me on Instagram and watch a 51-year-old doing jujitsu, then go follow my Instagram page, Brian Beckcom Lawyer.
No, that's perfect. And I'll attach the link to when I drop the episode so everyone can check that out.
Nice.
So, Brian, what is something that your parents did that you'd like to pass on to a next generation, your 3 kids? And what is something new or maybe you would leave out that your parents did?
The number one thing my dad gave me and my brother was the mentality, don't quit. Persistence wins. Don't quit. And so my personal view and what I've tried to pass on to my 3 kids is if you just stick at it, if you're just persistent, ultimately you will prevail. And so that's what I'm trying to pass on to my kids in terms of like stuff that that maybe I would leave out? I don't know. That's a hard question. I worry a little bit about our kids because they're about to be faced with AI, large language models, deepfake videos. They've got a lot of things they've got to deal with. They've got a dysfunctional political system that needs to be fixed, a lot of international hotspots right now. And so, I guess the mentality that I would have is I'm the biggest free market guy in the world. I believe in individual meritocracy. And if you start a company and you want to make $1 billion, go for it. I believe that. But I also believe that in a sense, we're all in this together. And we need to recognize that we're all in this together. So, for example, Jeff Bezos started Amazon, which is an incredible company. And he deserves to make millions and billions of dollars for what he's done for society. But without the roads that all of us pay for, he doesn't have a way to deliver his product. Without the mail system, without the U.S. military, without the police system and the fire system, Amazon is a nothing company. And we have to realize that it's a trade-off. America is about individual greatness, and it's about free market capitalism, but it's also about the realization that we're all in this together and we need to help each other out. And I hope at some point our politics will get to the point. Right now, it's either you're completely free market or you're completely social. I mean, it's like there's nothing in between anymore. And I hope that our kids will finally get to the point where they realize, like the Buddhists say, the best path usually is a middle path between the good on one side and the good on the other. And I think sometimes we forget about the fact when we talk about individual freedom, that with that freedom comes some responsibility to everybody else around you.
No, I think that's great. I completely agree. I sadly do not follow politics, but the main reason I don't follow politics is just because of the bipartisan nature of like red or blue. It can't be in between, which is this is why people don't talk about politics, because no one is just complete. Well, maybe nowadays, but they're not truly like red or completely blue. They're shades. You know what I mean? Like, if you agree with one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean you fall into the same exact pool. And that's all I'm going to say on that.
Exactly.
But
the middle path.
But thank you again for being on the show, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. Great time, man.
Great combo.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
If you like this week's episode of People More Interesting Than Me, please follow me on Apple Podcasts so you won't miss out on more episodes like these.